I've been reading about a man called Halbe. He was a Hauptmann, a captain, in the German army. In January 1942, he found himself inside the Cholm Pocket with 5,500 other men, cut off from the German line, surrounded on all sides by Soviet forces in the depths of a Russian winter. His specific position was the GPU ruin, a former Soviet secret police prison building in the eastern part of the town, a solid stone structure that the garrison had converted into a fortified strongpoint. Bika held that building against repeated Soviet attacks for weeks. On March 20th, 1942, he was awarded the Knight's Cross of the Iron Cross for its defence. It was one of the most deserved decorations awarded in the entire Cholm battle. He was killed in action 5 weeks later. 4 days before the pocket was relieved, and he never knew they made it. I came across Bika's story while going through accounts of the Cholm Pocket. I've got a copy of Richard Muck's Kampfgruppe Scherer on the shelf, one of those specialist Eastern Front titles that most people outside the history community have never heard of. And that specific detail stopped me. 4 days. The relief column broke through on May 5th, 1942. Bika died on May 1st. He had held his position for over 3 months, had been decorated for it, and died 4 days before it was over. I've wanted to make this video for a long time. I have shelves of books on Stalingrad, the Eastern Front encirclements, letters from men inside these pockets, and the thing that kept pulling me back every time I read about these battles is this: encirclement is supposed to mean death. In almost every war in human history, it has meant exactly that. And yet, on the Eastern Front between 1942 and 1945, the German army kept walking out of situations that should have been final, multiple times, against a Soviet military growing stronger every month, with supply lines cut, food running out, fuel exhausted, ammunition counted by the round. How they did it, and why it eventually stopped working, is one of the most extraordinary stories of the entire war. Encirclement has been the decisive act of war since before Rome. At Cannae, in 216 BC, Hannibal surrounded a Roman army of 70,000 and killed approximately 50,000 of them in a single afternoon, not by being stronger, not by having better weapons, by closing the circle and waiting for the mathematics to do the rest. An encircled army cannot resupply, cannot reinforce, cannot maneuver. It can only consume what it already has until what it has runs out, and then it dies or surrenders. Every commander from Caesar to Napoleon understood this. Encirclement was not just a tactical move, it was a death sentence delivered in military geometry. The Germans understood it too. They had used it themselves. The great encirclement battles of 1941, Kiev, Vyazma, Bryansk, had netted hundreds of thousands of Soviet prisoners in weeks. The German army had watched entire Soviet fronts collapse inside pockets, and had drawn the logical conclusion: once surrounded, you were finished. Then their own turn came, February 8th, 1942. The Red Army's Northwestern Front completed the encirclement of the German Second Army Corps south of Leningrad, in the swamp and forest country around a town called Demyansk. Inside the pocket, 6 divisions. The 12th, 30th, 32nd, 123rd and 290th Infantry Divisions, and the SS Division Totenkopf, approximately 90,000 men. Their commander, General Walter von Brockdorff-Ahlefeldt, issued his first order of the day, with the specific defiance of a man who has decided that the alternative to confidence is collapse. "There are 96,000 of us," he wrote. "The German soldier is superior to the Russian. This has been proven, so let the difficult times come. We are ready." The difficult times came. The Totenkopf division became the Pocket's fire brigade. When Soviet infantry broke through the perimeter, and they broke through repeatedly, in attacks that came sometimes a dozen times in a day, Totenkopf elements were moved by whatever transport existed to seal the breach. The SS troops were cold, exhausted, lice-ridden and suffering from frostbite. They drove off Soviet units greatly superior in numbers because the alternative was the pocket being split, and 90,000 men dying in sections rather than surviving as a whole. By the time the worst of the Soviet pressure eased in mid-March, Totenkopf had lost 7,000 men. By the end of the entire Demyansk ordeal, approximately 80% of the division's men were killed, wounded, or missing. The question of how 90,000 men were kept alive without a ground supply line was answered by the Luftwaffe. Hermann Göring assured Hitler that the Air Force could sustain the pocket. He was right, barely, and at enormous cost. Over 100 Junkers Ju-52 transport aircraft flew into the pocket every day, whitewashed against the snow, navigating by landmarks that changed as the battle shifted, landing on a strip that Soviet artillery targeted every hour of daylight. The Luftwaffe delivered an average of 273 tons of supplies per day. The pocket needed 300. The gap between what was needed and what arrived was filled by rationing so severe that men counted their daily food intake in spoonfuls, but they held. And on April 21st, 1942, Totenkopf and the other divisions launched their own attack toward the German lines and broke through the Soviet encirclement. 32,427 flights, 64,844 tons of cargo delivered, 22,903 wounded flown out, 265 aircraft lost, 387 airmen dead. The pocket had survived, and in surviving it had taught Hitler and Göring something that would kill 300,000 men at Stalingrad 8 months later. It had taught them that an encircled army could be kept alive from the air, that the mathematics of encirclement could be beaten by the Luftwaffe, that what had worked at Demyansk could work anywhere. It could not work anywhere, but they did not know that yet. 100 kilometers southwest of Demyansk, simultaneously a smaller and in some ways more savage story was playing out. The town of Cholm, January 21st, 1942. Soviet forces encircled a German garrison of approximately 5,500 men under General Major Theodor Scherer. The force was not a coherent division or corps, it was a collection of whatever units happened to be in or near Cholm when the encirclement closed. Parts of the 218th Infantry Division, a police battalion from Gelsenkirchen, Luftwaffe field troops, security units that had been designed for rear area operations and were now fighting for their lives on a front line that went all the way around them. Scherer had no heavy artillery, no tanks. The pocket was too small to land aircraft in. A runway required more space than Cholm's perimeter allowed. Supplies had to be dropped from the air and recovered by men, who ran into the open under Soviet fire to retrieve them. Among the airdrop supplies, in detail that I find extraordinary every time I read it, were 35 of the first 50 prototype assault rifles ever produced, the MKB-42, direct predecessor of the Sturmgewehr 44. The men of Cholm were test-firing the weapon that Stalingrad would make essential, while surviving the kind of encirclement that Stalingrad would make famous. For 105 days, Scherer's garrison held, 100 Soviet infantry attacks, 42 of them supported by tanks. The pocket's perimeter was 2 kilometers wide. Artillery support came from a German gun line 10 kilometers away, firing over the Soviet positions surrounding the pocket, indirect fire in support of men the gunners could not see, directed by radio from inside an encirclement that shrank a little more each week. When the German relief force finally broke through on May 5th, 1942, 1,200 men remained from the original 5,500. Scherer was awarded the Knight's Cross with oak leaves. He had earned it in a way that few decorations in the entire war were earned. 2 years passed. The German army had been through Stalingrad, through Kursk, through the long retreat across Ukraine. The encirclements of 1942 had been exceptional. By 1944, they were becoming routine. The Soviet military had learned from Demyansk and Cholm that surrounding Germans was easier than destroying them. The answer was to surround them faster, tighter, and with more force than could be broken from inside or relieved from outside. In January 1944, the 1st and 2nd Ukrainian fronts under Vatutin and Konev closed a pocket around 6 German divisions near the town of Korsun on the Dnieper, approximately 60,000 men. The formations included the 5th SS Panzer Division Wiking, the division of Scandinavian, Dutch, Belgian and other European volunteers that had fought on the Eastern Front since 1941, and the Walloon Volunteer Brigade under the Belgian fascist Léon de Grelle. Also inside, the 72nd, 57th and 88th Infantry Divisions, formations that had been fighting continuously since Barbarossa, and that were shadows of what they had been. The supply situation inside Korsun was different from Demyansk in one specific way that made it worse. The Luftwaffe was still flying, but the Ju-52s dropping fuel to the pocket were dropping petrol barrels into mud often 200 to 300 yards away from where they were needed, in fields that Soviet artillery had registered, and that became killing grounds every time a German soldier tried to retrieve the barrels. Steel wires were attached to winch them in. The men pulling the wires were exposed. Some of them died, getting the fuel that kept the remaining tanks moving. With ammunition and fuel taking priority in every drop, the panzer crews and grenadiers received little food. Manstein, commanding Army Group South from outside the pocket, ordered a relief operation. 3 Panzer Corps drove toward the encirclement through mud that swallowed vehicles and exhausted horses. They came close. They did not break through. The gap between the relief force and the pocket's perimeter was never closed by ground forces. On the night of February 16th to 17th, 1944, without consulting Hitler, Manstein ordered the breakout. It was led by SS Wiking, the strongest remaining formation inside the pocket. 40,000 men moved west in a stream that grew through the night, carrying everything they still had, trying to reach the German relief force before dawn made them visible. Dawn came. One survivor wrote about what happened at daybreak with a specificity that strips away every abstraction. Around 40,000 men had been flowing west in a constantly growing stream. Only a few kilometers remained between them and the relief force. Terrible was the disappointment and horror, he wrote, when at daybreak the densely grouped mass was met by murderous tank, anti-tank and artillery fire. Until now, the troops had carried all their heavy equipment through the deep, snow-encrusted gullies. All was now smashed to pieces by enemy shelling. The Soviet cavalry moved in. Marshal Konev described it afterward with a casual brutality that tells you everything about what the end of the Korsun breakout looked like. "We let the Cossacks cut up as long as they wished," he said. "They even hacked off the hands of those who raised them to surrender." General Stemmermann, commanding the pocket, died in the rear guard covering the breakout. Viking's commander Herbert Giller survived. De Grelle survived. Of the 60,000 men originally inside the pocket, 45,000 attempted the breakout. 35,000 reached German lines. 19,000 were dead, captured, or missing. The men who made it through arrived at German positions with no tanks, no vehicles, no artillery. Many had no weapons, some had no boots. The mud and snow of the Ukrainian steppe had taken everything except the men themselves. Korsun-Cherkasy was a survival. It was also a destruction. The formations that came out of that pocket existed on paper and had men attached to them and were not fighting formations in any meaningful sense until they were rebuilt over weeks in rear areas. The encirclement doctrine had worked. The cost of making it work had been almost everything. 6 weeks after Korsun, the 1st Panzer Army walked into the most extraordinary encirclement escape of the entire war. March 24th, 1944, Zhukov's 1st Ukrainian front and Konev's 2nd Ukrainian front closed a pocket around General Oberst Hans Valentin Huber's 1st Panzer Army near Kamenets-Podolski in western Ukraine. 220,000 men. Huber was one-armed. He had lost the arm in the First World War, and he had survived Stalingrad, being one of the last officers flown out of the pocket before Paulus surrendered. He understood what an encirclement meant when the airlift failed. He was not going to let his army become Stalingrad. Manstein's last act before being relieved by Hitler and replaced by Model was to order Hube to attempt a breakout. Then Manstein was gone, and Hube was alone with 220,000 men, and a decision about which direction to move. The Soviets expected him to break south. The distance to German lines was shorter in that direction, and the terrain was more manageable. Zhukov positioned his blocking forces accordingly. Hube broke west, not toward the nearest German positions. West, into the rear of the Soviet attack units that had driven past him during the encirclement, units that had outrun their supply lines, that were not positioned to receive an attack from behind them. The 1st Panzer Army began moving west while encircled, fighting as it moved, with assault guns and infantry at the vanguard and the panzers covering the rear against Soviet pursuit. The 2nd SS Panzer Corps, the Hohenstaufen and Frundsberg divisions, transferred from France with the D-Day landings less than 3 months away, drove east to meet Hube's pocket as it moved west. The two forces were moving toward each other across Ukrainian mud in the last days of March and first days of April 1944, one from inside an encirclement and one fighting through Soviet lines to reach it. I have a book on my shelf, Robert Forsick's The Kamenets-Podolski Pocket 1944, published by Osprey, that covers this operation in detail, and honestly every time I read the account of those final days I find it difficult to process that this actually happened. Forsick writes that the ability of Hube and his subordinates to motivate exhausted troops to conduct a desperate breakout across over 150 kilometers of enemy-held terrain in winter appears almost superhuman. On April 15th, 1944, the two forces linked up. The 1st Panzer Army had escaped. 220,000 men moving west while surrounded had walked out of an encirclement that Zhukov had designed to destroy them completely. Halbe flew to Hitler's headquarters on April 20th to receive the diamonds to his Knight's Cross, the highest military decoration in Germany. He died in a plane crash the following day. He never knew that the SS divisions transferred from France for his rescue had weakened the Western defences 2 months before the Allied landings at Normandy, April 1945. Berlin was surrounded, the Reich was collapsing from every direction simultaneously, and southeast of the capital in the Spree Forest, the German Ninth Army under General Theodor Busse found itself in the last major German encirclement of the war. The Ninth Army had already been gutted at the Silo Heights, the catastrophic defensive battle that opened the Soviet drive on Berlin. By the time the encirclement closed around April 21st, the army had fewer than 1,000 guns and mortars, approximately 79 tanks, and between 150 and 200 combat-ready armoured vehicles, approximately 80,000 soldiers. With them, caught by the speed of the Soviet advance, were an estimated 150,000 to 200,000 civilians, not just local residents but German refugees who had been fleeing westward from East Prussia and Silesia for months, whole families with carts and children, people who had been trying to get away from the war and had found themselves inside one of its last great encirclements. This is the detail that makes Halbe different from every other pocket in this video. Demyansk was soldiers, Cholm was soldiers, Korsun was soldiers. Halbe was soldiers and civilians mixed together in a forest, all trying to move in the same direction, all trying to get west before the ring closed completely. Hitler's orders to Busse were to break through to the 12th Army under General Walter Wenck and then push jointly toward Berlin. Busse and Wenck looked at the map and made a different decision. Both generals agreed, in direct violation of Hitler's explicit orders, that they would combine forces to establish a corridor not toward Berlin, but toward the Elbe, where American forces were waiting on the western bank. The goal was not to save Berlin. Berlin could not be saved. The goal was to get as many men and civilians as possible across the Elbe before the Soviets arrived. One survivor described the breakout through the Spree Forest in terms that captured what 60 kilometers of fighting withdrawal through woodland actually felt like. Those who embarked on the breakthrough ended up having to tackle one battle after another. The minute one obstruction had been surmounted, there was another one ahead of them, and then another. That happened day after day, for 60 long kilometers. The survivors reached the Elbe at Tangermunde between May 4th and May 7th, 1945, and crossed to surrender to the US 102nd Division. Approximately 25,000 soldiers made it through, along with several thousand civilians. By the time the Ninth Army escaped the Soviet pincers, it had suffered 40,000 killed and 60,000 taken prisoner. There are 15,000 Germans buried in the Halbe Forest Cemetery today, the largest war cemetery in Germany from the Second World War. Approximately 10,000 of them are unidentified. They have no names on their stones. They are soldiers who died in a forest in April 1945 trying to get west, whose identities the chaos of those final days erased completely. The war in Europe ended 7 days after the last survivors crossed the Elbe. Now, the shadow that hangs over every pocket in this video. In November 1942, while Totenkopf veterans were being rotated out of Demyansk for refit in France, while Cholm's 1,200 survivors were recovering in German rear areas, the Red Army launched Operation Uranus and closed a pocket around the German 6th Army at Stalingrad, approximately 250,000 men. General Friedrich Paulus commanding. Hitler declared them a fortress and told them to hold. Göring told Hitler the Luftwaffe could supply them. He based this promise on Demyansk. At Demyansk, 100,000 men had needed 300 tons of supplies per day. The Luftwaffe had delivered an average of 273 tons and the pocket had survived. The logic was simple: Stalingrad could be sustained the same way. The logic was catastrophically wrong. From the diary of Major Gerhard Engel, Hitler's army adjutant, recording the meeting where Göring made his promise, Reichsmarschall was enormously strong, said he would fly in any weather conditions. Demyansk and other cases had proved it possible. We were horrified at his optimism, which is not shared even by Luftwaffe General Staff. The Führer was enthusiastic about the Reichsmarschall who would deliver the goods as he had done in the past. The Luftwaffe General Staff's horror was justified. The mathematics were impossible, and everyone who looked at them clearly knew it. 250,000 men did not need 300 tons per day. They needed 750 tons per day. The Luftwaffe did not have the aircraft to deliver 750 tons per day to Stalingrad. Soviet air defences over Stalingrad were incomparably stronger than they had been over Demyansk. The distances from the nearest functional German airfields were greater. The winter weather in the Stalingrad region was worse. The Luftwaffe was delivering, on good days, 1/10 of what the 6th Army required. Paulus radioed repeatedly asking whether the tonnage figures he was receiving could be correct. They were correct. Men inside the pocket began dying of starvation and cold as much as from Soviet fire. The relief operation, Operation Winter Storm, 3 Panzer divisions driving toward the pocket, came within 50 kilometers of Stalingrad and was halted by Soviet counterattacks. The 6th Army could not break out to meet it, because Hitler had ordered them to hold and because they had consumed most of their fuel staying in place. On February 2nd, 1943, the last organised German resistance in Stalingrad surrendered. 91,000 men went into Soviet captivity. Fewer than 6,000 ever returned to Germany. The last Luftwaffe cargo drop over Stalingrad came on February 3rd, the day after the surrender. The supplies fell on ground where no German soldier remained alive to collect them. What made the difference between the pockets that survived and the one that didn't comes down to 3 things. Numbers. Demyansk had 90,000 men and needed 300 tons per day. Stalingrad had 250,000 men and needed 750 tons per day. The Luftwaffe that barely sustained Demyansk could not approach Stalingrad's requirement. Command. Halbe at Kamenets-Podolski moved. He did not wait for relief. He took 220,000 men and walked them west through enemy territory. Paulus at Stalingrad was ordered to hold and held, consuming the supplies that might have fueled a breakout. Busse at Halbe defied Hitler and headed for the Americans. Paulus obeyed Hitler and waited for an airlift that delivered 1/10 of what was needed. Cohesion. The formations that survived the Great Eastern Front encirclements, Totenkopf at Demyansk, Wiking at Korsun, the 1st Panzer Army at Kamenets-Podolski, were units with years of combat experience behind them, with NCOs and officers who had been through previous desperate situations and had developed a specific institutional understanding of how to function when everything around them was dissolving. They held together because the units held together. The 6th Army at Stalingrad held together too, but holding together in a static defence and holding together in a mobile breakout are different things, and by the time the option for a breakout existed, the army had consumed the fuel it would have needed to attempt one. The German army's ability to break encirclements was not magic, it was the product of specific qualities: unit cohesion, command initiative, the willingness of individual soldiers to keep moving when stopping meant death, applied in specific conditions. When those conditions were present, as they were at Demyansk, Cholm, Korsun and Kamenets-Podolski, men walked out of situations that should have been final. When the conditions were absent, or the mathematics were impossible, as they were at Stalingrad, 250,000 men became 91,000 prisoners. I keep coming back to Karl, the corporal in the Totenkopf division who wrote that they did not survive because of orders. They survived because none of them were willing to be the first man to stop. That sentence applies to every pocket in this video. It applies to Scherer's 1,200 survivors at Cholm, running into the open to retrieve supply crates under Soviet fire. It applies to Wiking leading 40,000 men west through the Ukrainian night at Korsun, carrying their equipment through snow-encrusted gullies until the artillery found them at dawn. It applies to Halbe's army moving west through enemy territory for 3 weeks. It applies to the men at Halbe fighting through 60 kilometers of forest with 79 tanks, and 200,000 civilians among them. It does not apply to Stalingrad. At Stalingrad, men stopped, not because they were willing to stop, but because the mathematics stopped them. No amount of willingness could fill the gap between 273 tons per day and 750 tons per day. No unit cohesion could replace fuel that was not delivered. No command initiative could manufacture an order to break out that Hitler refused to give until it was too late to execute. Demyansk worked, Cholm worked, Korsun barely, at catastrophic cost, Kamenets-Podolski remarkably, Halbe partially, for 25,000 men out of 200,000 who tried. Stalingrad did not work. And the reason Stalingrad did not work is that the men who decided it could work had looked at Demyansk and drawn the wrong conclusion. The helmet on my desk doesn't tell me which of these stories the man who wore it came from. It might be Demyansk, it might be somewhere else entirely, But sitting here after reading every account of every one of these pockets, I think about him differently than I did before I started. Whoever he was, whatever pocket he found himself in, whatever morning he woke up surrounded with the supply line cut and the temperature at -40 and the Soviet attack coming again, he made the same calculation that every man in every encirclement made. Keep moving. Don't be the first man to stop. Some of them made it, some of them didn't. The ones who made it left behind accounts that are, even now, 80 years later, almost impossible to read without understanding that what human beings are capable of enduring is something that no comfortable life in peacetime ever prepares you to grasp. This is the story of the German encirclements. I hope you found it as extraordinary as I always have. The story of the German encirclements on the Eastern Front does not exist in isolation. It exists within a much larger story about what happens to armies when they are cut off from everything that sustains them, and what specific qualities allow some of those armies to survive while others don't. To understand why the Germans kept doing what no other army in modern history has consistently managed, you have to understand what the Eastern Front had done to these men by 1942. By the time Demyansk closed around the Second Corps and the Totenkopf Division, those formations had been fighting continuously since June 1941, 18 months of Barbarossa. The summer advances of 1941 that covered hundreds of miles in weeks. The autumn, Rasputitsa, the mud season, when everything slowed. The winter counter-offensive that pushed them back from Moscow's suburbs. The specific psychological transformation that occurs in men who have been in continuous mortal danger for 18 months, who have watched everyone around them die or be wounded and replaced and die again, who have developed a relationship with survival that peacetime soldiers cannot replicate in any training exercise. These men were not especially brave in the abstract sense, they were experienced. Experience on the Eastern Front by 1942 meant something very specific. The ability to function under conditions that would paralyze less tested soldiers. The ability to make a correct tactical decision in 3 seconds because the alternative is dying in the 4th second. The ability to keep moving when every physical signal your body is sending says stop. The Totenkopf soldiers who held the Demyansk perimeter through the winter of 1942, who were cold, exhausted, lice-ridden and frostbitten, and who drove off Soviet units greatly superior in numbers, were doing something that looked superhuman from the outside and that from the inside was simply the continuation of what they had been doing since the summer of 1941. They had been in situations this bad before. They had survived them. The specific institutional memory of surviving bad situations is what allowed them to survive worse ones. This is the thing that does not appear in the operational histories and the order of battle analyses. The German army's ability to break encirclements was not primarily a function of doctrine, though the doctrine helped. It was not primarily a function of equipment, though the equipment mattered at the margins. It was a function of the specific human quality that 2 years of the hardest fighting in modern military history had produced in the survivors, the absolute refusal to accept that the situation was terminal. One soldier from the Korsun Pocket, writing about the breakout in February 1944, described the specific experience of being in a mass of 40,000 men all moving in the same direction through darkness and snow with Soviet forces on all sides. He wrote that fear was not the right word for what he felt. He had been afraid many times on the Eastern Front, and this was different. He wrote that what he felt in the Korsun breakout was something closer to clarity. The specific mental state that arrives when every option except forward has been eliminated, when the mathematics of the situation have resolved into a single variable, which is how fast you can move, and whether it is fast enough. He moved. The men around him moved. Some of them died moving. More of them died than would have died if the operation had succeeded cleanly, which it did not. It was messy and bloody, and the Cossacks came with their sabres in the dawn, and Stemmermann died in the rear, and the men who arrived at German lines had lost everything. But they were alive. The men who stopped were not. The contrast with Stalingrad is not primarily a contrast between 2 different armies or 2 different commanders. It is a contrast between 2 different situations, one of which offered the possibility of the forward momentum that kept men alive and one of which did not. Paulus was not a weaker commander than Halbe. The 6th Army was not a less experienced formation than the 1st Panzer Army. The difference was that the 6th Army was ordered to hold and held, consuming the fuel and the supplies and the days that a breakout would have required, until the moment when a breakout was no longer mathematically possible. When Hitler finally authorized a breakout in January 1943, it was too late. The army had no fuel to move its vehicles and no food to sustain the men on foot, for the distance they would have needed to cover. The airlift delivered in its best periods approximately 100 tons per day to Stalingrad. The army needed 750. On some days the delivery was as low as 40 tons. There were days when nothing arrived at all. The Ju-52 crews who flew the Stalingrad missions knew what they were doing, and they knew the mathematics, they knew the gap between what they could deliver and what was needed, and they flew anyway, in temperatures and weather conditions that killed aircraft and crews at rates that the Luftwaffe's transport capacity could not absorb. They were brave men flying an impossible mission in service of a promise that should never have been made. Göring made the promise because Demyansk had worked. Demyansk had worked because the specific conditions at Demyansk, the size of the pocket, the number of men, the weakness of Soviet air defences, the distances involved, the number of available transport aircraft, had been within the range of what the Luftwaffe could manage, barely and at great cost. None of those conditions applied at Stalingrad. Every single variable was worse. More men, longer distances, stronger Soviet air defences, more aircraft needed, fewer available. The lesson Demyansk taught was not that air supply could save any encircled army. The lesson it taught was that air supply could save that specific encircled army in those specific conditions. The generalization from specific conditions to universal principle is one of the most consequential mistakes in the history of modern warfare. The men who paid for that mistake were not the men who made it. Göring survived the war. Yashonek, the Luftwaffe chief of staff who gave the assurance that the airlift was possible, died by his own hand in August 1943, but not because of Stalingrad specifically. Hitler survived until April 1945, still giving orders to armies that no longer existed. The 91,000 men who marched into Soviet captivity at Stalingrad in February 1943 paid for the mistake. Of those 91,000, fewer than 6,000 returned to Germany. The rest died in Soviet prisoner of war camps from starvation, cold, disease, and the specific brutality of a captivity system that was not designed to return them alive. The last German prisoners of Stalingrad were released from Soviet captivity in 1955, 12 years after the battle ended. Some of them had been 20 years old when they were captured. They were 32 when they came home. The Eastern Front encirclements as a set of battles tell you something specific about the limits of what military skill and unit cohesion can achieve. They can achieve extraordinary things. They can sustain 90,000 men in a frozen pocket against repeated assault when the airlift barely delivers enough. They can hold 5,500 men in a town too small to land aircraft in for 105 days. They can move 220,000 men westward through enemy territory for 3 weeks and bring them out largely intact. They can push 25,000 soldiers and civilians through 60 kilometers of Soviet-held forest in the last days of a collapsing war. What they cannot achieve is the replacement of fuel that wasn't delivered, food that didn't arrive, ammunition that was consumed waiting for a rescue that the mathematics made impossible. The human qualities that produce the Eastern Front encirclement escapes, the unit cohesion, the command initiative, the absolute refusal to be the first man to stop, were real and remarkable. They were also insufficient at Stalingrad because at Stalingrad the gap between what was possible and what was needed was larger than human qualities could bridge. Karl, the Totenkopf corporal from the Demyansk Pocket, wrote that they survived because none of them were willing to be the first man to stop. He was right. He was also lucky, in the specific way that the men of Demyansk and Cholm and Korsun and Kamenets-Podolski were lucky. Not lucky to have survived in the abstract sense, but lucky to have been in pockets where survival was within the range of what human qualities could achieve. The men of Stalingrad had the same qualities. The mathematics didn't leave room for those qualities to matter. That is the honest story of the German encirclements, not a story of superhuman soldiers defying all odds. A story of specific human qualities producing specific results in specific conditions, and of what happens when those conditions tip past the point where any human quality is sufficient. The helmet on my desk sits there and doesn't tell me its story. It came from the Eastern Front somewhere, from one of these battles or another one entirely. The man who wore it made the same calculations as every man in every pocket. He either kept moving or he didn't. He either made it or he didn't. 80 years later, in a room far from any of it, his helmet sits on a desk next to books about the battles he fought in, and that is the only answer available to the question of what happened to him. There is one more thing about Cholm that deserves to be said because it sits at the centre of everything this video is about. The men defending Cholm were not elite soldiers. They were not the Totenkopf or the Viking or any of the formations that appear in the histories of German military excellence. They were rear area security troops, a police battalion from a city in the Ruhr, Luftwaffe ground crew who had been handed rifles and told to hold a perimeter. The 281st Security Division, which provided Scherer's corps, had been designed to secure supply routes against partisans, not to hold a fortified town against Soviet infantry and tank attacks for 105 days. This is the thing that makes Cholm more remarkable than Demyansk in some ways, and less discussed. Demyansk had the Totenkopf, it had 5 full infantry divisions with years of frontline experience behind them. It had commanders who had managed desperate situations before. Cholm had Scherer, who had been a security division commander, and 5,500 men who had been doing rear area work when the encirclement closed around them. One soldier from the Cholm garrison described the first week of the encirclement with a detail that captures the specific quality of what those men were asked to do. He wrote that they had been told the relief would come in days, then weeks. Then they stopped being told anything about relief and started being told about holding. He wrote that the difference between those two instructions, hold until relief comes and hold, is the difference between a temporary difficulty and a permanent condition. He wrote that the men who held Cholm for 105 days did it by deciding at some point in the first few weeks that there was no relief coming, and that holding was simply what they did now. Not holding until something changed, just holding. 1,200 survivors from 5,500, Scherer's oak leaves, the Cholm shield, a sleeve badge awarded to the survivors like the Demyansk shield, commemorating a specific encirclement survived. These are the official records of what happened at Cholm. The unofficial record is the specific decision made by 5,500 non-elite soldiers to hold a perimeter 2 kilometers wide against 100 infantry attacks, 42 of them supported by tanks, for 105 days, with supplies falling from aircraft they could not land. Hans Valentin Huber had one arm. He had lost the other one in the First World War, in the mud of the Western Front, fighting in a war that Germany also lost. He had rebuilt his career in the Reichswehr and then the Wehrmacht, had commanded at Stalingrad and been one of the last officers evacuated by air before the surrender, had watched from a transport aircraft as the city was sealed permanently behind him. When the encirclement closed at Kamenets-Podolski in March 1944, Hube was not a man who needed to be told what encirclement meant. He had seen it from the inside at Stalingrad, and had come out on one of the last flights. He was not going to watch his army become Stalingrad from inside the pocket this time. The decision to go west rather than south was his, made in coordination with Manstein before Manstein was relieved. It was a decision that depended on understanding the enemy's expectations and doing the opposite. On knowing that Zhukov would position his blocking forces on the southern axis, because the southern axis was the logical route, and that the logical route was therefore the wrong route. Military history is full of commanders who knew this principle. It is much less full of commanders who applied it correctly, with 220,000 men's lives depending on the application. Hube organised the army into 2 parallel columns before beginning the move. Headquarters and non-combat personnel were sent to safety first, before the encirclement tightened fully, because Hube understood that a moving pocket needed fighters, not administrators. Assault guns and infantry at the vanguard to break through Soviet positions ahead. Panzers at the rear to stop Soviet pursuit from collapsing the column from behind. The pocket moved like a fist punching west through the hand, trying to close around it. The diamonds to the Knight's Cross that Hitler awarded Hube on April 20th was the correct recognition of the most operationally impressive German achievement of 1944. Hube died in a plane crash the following morning, flying back from the ceremony. He had escaped Stalingrad and Kamenets-Podolski and 18 months of fighting on the Eastern Front, and died in a Heinkel He 111 in the Bavarian Alps. These are the ironies that the Eastern Front produced in quantities sufficient to fill libraries.